please silence your phone.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Welcome, welcome. I do a lot of these. I am actually, you'll see in the program, I'm in 10 hereditary societies. Daughters of the American Revolution, Colonial Dames of the 17th Century, Colonial Dames of America. I'm also in First Families of North Carolina. I'm in Founders and Patriots of America. I'm also in New England Women. And so, of course, when you're in that many organizations, and I've held offices in those organizations, and one of the things that I love genealogy, and so I'm always finding like new ancestors, and I was surprised to find out that even I have an ancestor, well, really two, who were here. Because when the Menorcans came, they brought a Spanish man with them, and he's my 5th great grandfather. And then also there's a group of people called the Lincolnville leaseholders, who, I don't know if you heard of them, but when the people of African descent were emancipated in Lincolnville, it became Lincolnville, they had a piece of property called Liberation Lot. And when they emancipated the people, they put 262 people on this Liberation Lot. And that was January the 1st, 1863. But then in 1866, they rented out these lots, 50 by 100 lots, for $1 a year. So it was 6 people, and I found out that I was a descendant of one of them also. Now, I was raised in Jersey. My family's from North Carolina, and I've traced my European ancestry at my best back to 1569, and actually went there to England and looked at the records. One of the reasons why I love this so much is because they're stories that people don't know about, and people tend to separate, you know, like, okay, Native American, people of African descent, the Menorcans, but most of those people ended up marrying each other. So this has been going on for years. And so I am in an organization which is relatively new, which is called the Society of the First African Families in English America. So I don't know if any of you have heard of 1619. My 9th great grandmother was Margaret Cornish, and she was one of those people stolen from the Zinga in Angola. And you'll hear people say, oh, well, that's when slavery started, but that's not true. Here in 1565, they brought some enslaved people in here, but it was not slavery. There was no chattel slavery back in those years. So they were indentured. And I actually have documentation. I can prove a lot of things by my DNA, but even before DNA, I was going to the courthouses, I didn't start going to the cemeteries until late, but I started going to the courthouses, to different places, looking up wills, And I'm blessed on the best mind because I think every one of my great-grandfathers had wills, except for my immediate great-grandfather and my grandfather. They didn't have wills, but all their ancestors had wills. So it was easier to prove. So in the Society of the First African Families in English America, most of the people in our organization can go back to 1619. And I have paperwork that shows that Margaret Cornish was released from her taxes because of her age. So that proves to you she was not enslaved, because if she was enslaved, she wouldn't be paying taxes. So what part did Florida men of color and the Gullah play in the American Revolution? Now, one of the things a lot of people, how many people know who the Gullah people are? Oh, good. Because sometimes our people are coming to the museum and they're not familiar with the Gullah. But the Gullah were actually people who came from West Africa who were on that coast. If you see that coast there, that is, it's supposed to go down to St. Augustine, but that particular one doesn't. And everybody probably recognizes Fort Mose, and there's two of my friends who are reenactors at Fort Mose. So one thing that was going on was that people were traveling up and down. The Spanish told people of African descent and Native Americans, if you come to Florida, get baptized Catholic, you will be free. And so that was a lot of the people who were heading down from South Carolina, Georgia, those border states. So the Gullah men are descendants of Africans that lived along the coastal low country, South Carolina, Georgia, and Spanish Florida. They were active participants in the American Revolution, though their stories are often ignored. They fought, spied, piloted boats, built fortifications, and leveraged shifting empires to protect their families and communities. And one thing about being in the Daughters of the American Revolution, I've been a member for about 12 years, that you find out that everybody who is recognized did not actually physically fight. If you gave a pound of potatoes or somehow you helped the troops, then you were given credit, and all you have to do is prove that your ancestor aided and abetted the people who were the British. But one of the things we talk about is also the people who fought against the British. And when you get involved in Florida, so the people, the Gullah Geechee Coast, Colleton County, South Carolina, Beaufort District. I'm also a descendant of the Gullah. I'm a little bit of everything. And my ancestors were on the Fusky Island. So I knew about my ancestors, and you know, our ancestors travel. They don't stay in that same place. They might move. My mother and father were part of the migration that moved in the 1920s from down south to north. So I was born in North Carolina, left there at the age of 2, and I was raised in New Jersey. So I didn't find out about the DeFusky until later because I'm a descendant of the Hamiltons. And all the Hamiltons I found, my 4th great grandmother was a free woman of color, and she was married to a man who was enslaved. And so I saw them early on the census together, and then later on, I saw she came back to DeFusky Island in 1880. So the St. Simon's Island, coastal Georgia, South Carolina, Spanish Florida, Fort Mose, and that is what they call the first free African settlement that's in the United States, because even though we had the 20 and odd, they were on like different plantations, tiny plantations. So it wasn't until Fort Mose where the people actually got together and had a community, and they were self-governed. So the men, one thing about the Gullah, they carried the African language, rice culture, and you hear so much about the rice. Actually, you'll hear people say, oh, when Africans came here, they didn't have anything, they didn't know anything. The people in Sierra Leone were deliberately picked for their rice culture skills. And so they made Charleston rich, which then made other people rich. But some people from Hilton Head went to Sierra Leone, and they were making the baskets the same way that they had made 400 years ago. And they passed that skill. And some of you might have been in Charleston and those areas when you see the people make the sweet grass baskets. Well, it's become difficult for the Gullah people because a lot of places are putting up fences where they can't just gather this grass along the side of the road. So they have to bargain on being able to get their product to make these baskets. And so one of the things you see is their military experience was shaped by plantation labor, the Patriot side. It's rarer in the Deep South, but some free African enslaved Gullah men served as substitutes for the European draftees. They worked as pilots, sailors, teamsters, and spies. Later, they filed pension applications under their new names. And I had that happen to me with my second great-grandfather. I wrote a book, and he was a free man of color in the Civil War. So when he went to get his pension, he told them that his name was Fuller. And they were like, well, we don't have a Thomas Fuller. And so he had his comrades who came and spoke for him and said when he went in the military, he went under his mother's name. So she was a free woman of color. So back in that day, if you weren't married, you were a woman, your children went under the mother's name. So they explained that we knew him, we knew that his mother was a Lucas, and he went in under the Lucas name, but then after emancipation, his mother and father could get married, because they couldn't get married before, and then he started using the Fuller name. And so one of the things I'm running into now, many of you might have heard of Antonio Proctor. He was a free African soldier tied to Fort Mose in Spanish Florida. Juan Bautista Proctor associated with the Turnbull Plantation. So how many people know about the Turnbull Plantation? A lot? A few? Well, there was a gentleman who, I don't know if I want to call him a gentleman. He wasn't a nice man. He convinced 1,400 people, mostly Menorcans, people of Spanish descent, to come and be indentured. And so they went to New Smyrna Beach, and when he took them there, he made all these promises. They were going to be there for 3 years. He ended up starving them. He went back to England, left them under the purview of people who did not treat them correctly. They had to plant their own food. So what happened is they got upset. They went there in 1768. A lot of people died because of the poor treatment. New Smyrna was like another swamp, and so people were being bitten by mosquitoes and, dealing with swamp life. And that was, really difficult. So what they did is they got fed up. They came into St. Augustine, talked to the governor, and talked about how poorly they were treated. And he gave them permission to be free. They walked 70 miles from New Smyrna Beach to here, to St. Augustine, and started their life here. So one of the people I ran across was with a different name. His name was George Jobs Ferguson. And he was married to a lady named Chloe DuPont, and her father, Aaron James DuPont, was one of those men who was given, who was leased those properties, the 50 by 100. And so his name is mentioned different times. And you see he's from Colleton County. And so the Gullimen were indispensable because of their swamp warfare skills. Everybody didn't fight in the city. They had other skills. And so they lived in the swamp. The ancestors go back to the Great Dismal Swamp and the Turnbull Swamp and other low country regions. The British period was from 1763 to 1784. So after the fighting in Georgia and Florida, all it took was a signature on a piece of paper in Europe. And it's amazing how all these things were going on here in the States, but they're being controlled by Europe. And so I'm learning things every day. There's a little city, I guess they call it a city, called Switzerland. Okay, so Switzerland, the gentleman that owned that land, that went to the British for that land, he was given 10,000 acres. And so that was originally a plantation. And we used to live in Mandarin, and so we used to drive and come down through Switzerland, and we had no idea who he was, but he was actually Fatio. He is the one who got that land to build and have a plantation there. And the reason why it's called Switzerland, because that's where he's from. Y'all never knew that? She didn't know. Okay, so what happened is when they started having the fighting, and you know, first Spain had St. Augustine, then it was transferred to the British, then it went back to Spain. When it was transferred to the British, a lot of the people of African descent and some other people went to Cuba. And so they were all like hiding out in Cuba. And then oddly enough, what some people don't know, some of them came back here. And so some of those names like Proctor end up back here in St. Augustine. So Spain's principal seaport and administrative headquarters for much of Spanish America. Spain also lost Manila in the Spanish Philippines, and it was a point of wealth of Asia. The Treaty of Paris, ending the war, left Canada to the English, returned several Caribbean islands to the French, and they headed for Havana and Manila in exchange for the province of Florida. They had a group called the Florida Rangers, and in addition to the regular army, locals in Florida also took up arms against rebellious colonists of all the provincial troops. Now, even though we know that those people, the Gullah people, the people from Georgia, South Carolina, came here, the British snuck down here and tried to come back because they figured or thought that, okay, you're taking away my enslaved people, so you're taking away my profit. So they had constant back and forth with people running away, coming here, and then people coming back and trying to get them and take them back. So the East Florida Rangers were formed in 1776, and they consisted of 130 men organized into 4 companies. Now, one of the things you hear about is when you start talking about people who were in the Revolutionary War, you usually hear numbers like 3,000, 4,000. It was actually more than 10,000 people of African descent who fought in the Revolutionary War. When the war broke out, the garrison troops of St. Augustine were acquainted with the wooded terrain. So they were used to fighting in the swamps, and they had skills, like they ran boats, and you know, when they decided to go to Spain, I was like, well, how did they get there? They had like 11 boats that took them, to Cuba, and so they hid out in Cuba. Most of the war took place in the north of Florida, but they crossed border raids. The governor of Louisiana, Baton Rouge, all of these people were involved. The wars of unpopularity and massive expense continued until Britain was forced to concede American independence. Having lost control of the majority of the colonies, Britain had the interest in keeping Florida.
Now, it was an isolated outpost. It had little prospect of staying productive. So on September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the American Revolution. So the 250 years, so this is the anniversary of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So it's called the semi-quincentennial. Yes. 250 years. So now that most of the people in the population, many of them came back to this area. They were stationed on frontiers rather than in town. The Rangers detached constant, successive scouting parties. So one of the things you've heard about the natives, the Seminoles, who helped the people of African descent to hide because there was effort to try to get rid of them, of the Seminoles. Since they were under the control of the governor and loosely organized, the existence of the Rangers aroused constant dispute of command between the military and civilian authorities. In 1779, the East Florida Rangers were recognized. So a lot of these men, they didn't know they were actually fighting or doing anything until they filed for their pensions. And then the thing is, they might have had one name or no last name when they were enslaved, but then when they got out of that condition, they ended up choosing the name either because of the plantation they were on or because of other families. So they were under the governor's control and loosely organized. The East Florida Rangers ended up getting reorganized. Freedom was offered to the enslaved men that fled their patriot owners. And of course they stayed here because they didn't want to be enslaved. They knew the marshes, they knew how to handle boats, navigation. They had multilingual languages, African languages, English and Spanish, and they conducted intelligence gathering through kinship and plantation networks. Government fought the American Revolution on their own terms, using military service as a pathway to freedom, land, and community survival. How government served. Spanish militia and Fort Mose, while under Spain, free men of the African diaspora and formerly enslaved refugees served as armed militia members defending St. Augustine against British attacks. The infantry soldiers, scouts, sentries, artillery assistants, swamp and coastal guards. Military service equaled legal freedom, land, and protection for the family, created by the black military tradition in Florida before the American Revolution. So when Florida was officially transferred to the English, most of the Spanish residents chose to depart for Cuba. This exodus temporarily depopulated the peninsula, but Florida was on the eve of the greatest population explosion. And the English crown of 1763 outlawed settlement west of the Appalachians. This promoted Florida as a new area of British colonization. Over the next 25 years, Fort Mose and Spanish St. Augustine became a sanctuary for Africans seeking liberation from the tyranny of the English slavery system. A lot of this information can be found in records like when the people from the Turnbull plantation came here, there was a church that they had in New Smyrna. That church came here with them. So if you ever go, I'm a member of the Historical Society, and you're surprised at some of the church records and some of the information you will find on records going back to the 1700s. So Fort Mose has been recognized for its national significance after 40 years of collaboration between archaeologists, volunteers, Florida Park Service, artists, and public officials. The reconstruction of the fort is complete. How many people have been out there? Yep, they redid the building. It's nice. The wood there is beautiful. The first time the British burned Fort Mose in 1740, they burned it to the ground. And so the people were still living in the area. They weren't protected by the fort. And then the fort sank. And so now that they've rebuilt the fort, it's really, I guess, a symbol of resistance. England had a strong desire to develop the Florida trade. The London Board of Trade advertised 20,000-acre lots to any group willing to enter Florida. And think about it, that's a lot of land. That's a lot of land. And so in London, they granted people titles, they gave pioneer families land. To recruit Southerners, slavery was allowed. So that whole system of Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, people going back and forth. There was much to celebrate in English Florida. The population of St. Augustine nearly doubled. Commerce and trade was growing, including cattle ranching, shipping, and plantation agriculture. Andrew Turnbull, he had indigo. So he had the people growing indigo, and that was what they worked in primarily. The French and Indian War changed the relationship between the northern colonies and their mother country. This was a British stronghold. As the capital of East Florida, St. Augustine rapidly became a military stronghold and the central command post for operations in the southern colonies. England decided to utilize Florida as a staging area for British troops. So when you don't hear anything about Florida being involved in the Revolutionary War, you see that's not the case. Now there was a situation where three of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Hayward, Arthur Middleton, and Edward Rutledge, who was South Carolina's lieutenant governor, Kristen Gatson, they were held in solitary confinement at the Fort's jail for 42 weeks. So these are just some of the books that I used. The Black Seminoles, the 14th Colony, A Man Called Horse. So I'm open for questions, and if anybody has it, we'll keep it. She said she's gonna let the other speaker.
Yeah,
and then
we'll do
we're
the
gonna-
Q&A afterwards.
Yes.
For everyone, yeah.
Very well.
There have been a series of these events going around now about the 250th anniversary, and it's sort of interesting to finally have the Spanish included in that discussion. And because I had the good fortune to be educated here in Florida and to work with Kathy Vegan and Eugene Lyon and some of the wonderful historians here in Florida, I did that. I switched from another field to Spanish Florida. So, but I hadn't really concentrated on the American Revolution. As Gigi talked about, I really was focused primarily on the earlier colonial. But I have moved forward, of course, and I'll try to cover some of that today for you. So, and I also like to thank the people that help me with the tech, because I'm not tech savvy. All right, well, you know, I said this talk is basically about the American Revolution, but my part in it is Spain's role in creating black militias over centuries that finally we also will see serving in the American Revolution period, but it was centuries old in formation. But to get started really on the American Revolution part, in 1775, Virginia's Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, issued a proclamation offering liberty to all enslaved blacks who would join Great Britain's military forces and defeat the rebellious Americans fighting for their independence. In doing so, he followed a Spanish model in practice for more than a century. The story of Great Britain's black loyalists and their eventual diaspora to Nova Scotia, the Bahamas, London, and Sierra Leone has received considerable attention, but less attention has been focused on the black troops Spain deployed in the American Revolution. So let's see, is it this way? There's Lord Dunmore in his fancy outfit, and his proclamation offering the freedom. Oops, I'm sorry. There's one of the passes that was given by the British to anybody who would serve as a black loyalist. In the 16th century, however, long before that, the Spanish army was reputed to be the best in the world. And it was surprisingly heterogeneous, employing volunteers and mercenaries from a wide variety of nationalities in their forces, although they would usually be commanded by a Spanish officer. Given these precedents and the limited number of regular forces available for duty, it should come as no surprise that once Spain acquired a vast American empire, the armies it deployed in the Americas were equally diverse. In Europe, Spain filled its armies with Germans, Italians, Irish, and other foreigners who fought alongside Spanish peasants. In the Americas, Spain depended instead upon indigenous allies and a core of Africans and men of African descent, enslaved and free, to explore and conquer its new claims. And perhaps the most famous was, or well known at least, was Juan Garrido, a free and literate African who joined Spanish expeditions in Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Florida, and Cuba before joining Hernando Cortez in the conquest of the Aztec Empire. He left a paper trail of his services when requesting reward from the Spanish monarch. And this is an image from an Aztec codice that shows him marching with the armies of Cortez, with Doña Marina, or Malinche, as she's sometimes known, in the front, but the indigenous porters in the back, and the black man who is serving with Cortez was Juan Garrido. But as we have studied in our histories, newly introduced pathogens devastated the native populations across the whole Americas, and Spain became even more dependent upon black military forces. Especially this was true in the Circum-Caribbean, where slaves and former slaves of the Spanish helped maintain a tenuous control over thinly populated and greatly dispersed colonies like Florida that were under almost constant foreign attack and encroachment. Much of Spain's imperial expanse was an undermanned frontier where every hand counted. As Spain struggled to control its extensive frontiers, it was also hard-pressed to defend the Caribbean ports through which the American trade and treasures passed. Havana was the most significant of all of those rendezvous points for the treasure fleets, and patterns established there were emulated in Florida and elsewhere in the Circum-Caribbean. So here's a little map of the main port cities and the routes of the treasure fleets in the 16th century that gives you a little bit of a sense. We're kind of off the map a little bit north of that, but as I would tell my students, you know, you had to all congregate back in Havana and then take a right and go up north to Spain, take another right. And so it became important just as a place to pass by, and that's why we have these great fortresses like the Castillo de San Marcos and all the other Antonelli forts around the Caribbean. Anyway, by the 17th century, Spain was battling an assortment of other European challengers in what they called the Spanish Lake, this Caribbean. And faced with losing it all, it was forced to innovate, employing a mixed labor force of forzados, which were condemned prisoners, African slaves, and occasionally subjected Indians. Spain erected those great stone forts at Havana, Santo Domingo, San Juan, Cartagena, Portobelo, Acapulco, and St. Augustine, as well as many minor constructions in lesser ports along its threatened coast. Spain also maintained naval squadrons and small army garrisons in the region, most of which were chronically under strength. By arming former slaves was what enabled Spain to hold the Circum-Caribbean for over 3 centuries. In Cuba, they organized a militia which incorporated many persons of color, as they called it, and by 1600, Cuba's free pardos, which were persons of African and European descent, their company numbered 100 men. Spanish Jamaica's governor also organized a company of free pardos, and it may indicate an early attempt to restrict formal military service to free persons having at least some European ancestry. But necessity trumped racial and legal exclusivity when Spain began losing both treasure fleets and territory. Repeated assaults on the coastal settlements of New Granada, which we call Colombia today, left settlers haunted by the fear of invasion through the colonial period, according to one historian. And recognizing that Spain could not respond quickly enough with metropolitan troops to the escalating foreign threats in the Circum-Caribbean, the king ordered the Viceroy of New Spain, which is today Mexico, to evaluate the formation of more free black companies. His order noted that the people of color who defended his realms were, quote, persons of valor who fought with vigor and reputation. And this important metropolitan acknowledgement apparently encouraged enlistments. A Central American roster from 1673 listed almost 2,000 pardos serving in the infantry units throughout the Isthmus of Central America. And similar units of free blacks, or morenos as they were called also, were organized in Española, Veracruz, Campeche, Puerto Rico, Panama, Caracas, Cartagena, and finally in 1683 in Florida. And when the last Habsburg king of Spain died in 1700, French Bourbons assumed the Spanish throne, and they launched a series of reforms aimed at more effective control of empire and resources. By this time, Spain had depended on black military service in the Caribbean for more than 2 centuries. Spain's Bourbon reformers formalized that relationship with a document they called the Reglamento para las Milicias de Infantería y Caballería de la Isla de Cuba. And it just is a military reorganization of Cuba, Florida, Puerto Rico, Louisiana, and Panama. Well, upon joining these units, men of African descent became part of, in at least theoretically, colorblind military corporations. The Crown encouraged enlistment by exempting recruits from tribute payments and certain municipal taxes or levies. It also allowed the black troops to elect their own officers, a practice already observed in the provincial militias, and most importantly, the Crown extended the fuero militar to these black units, and that was an exemption basically from tribunal punishment by civilians. You would only be tried in military courts. The fuero militar also granted these black militiamen who served in the military hospitalization, retirement, and death benefits, and the right to wear uniforms and bear arms. Officers were also entitled to use the honorific don before their names. Like titles, clothing was an important marker of rank in the Spanish world, and the new black units paid particular attention to the design of their uniforms, informing Spain in great detail about their selection of colors, boots, hats, and even buttons. And these are some of the different uniforms that we found in Havana and Santo Domingo, as a matter of fact. Black militiamen wore these impressive outfits as they drilled on Sundays in the central plazas of towns throughout the Atlantic, making an important Spanish social statement as they marched. In public ceremonies in the same plazas, Spanish officers honored black militiamen for exceptional bravery and on retirement after 25 to 50 years of military service. The Diario de la Habana, which was a newspaper printed in Cuba, later reported on such honorific ceremonies, listing the names of the men who received gold or silver medals bearing the likenesses of the Spanish monarchs or the escutcheon of fidelity. Commending their loyal and efficient service, the king ordered Havana's officials to see that his black vassals were well treated, and he forbade anyone from making racial slurs against them, indicating, however, that that was common enough in Havana. Not even prejudice and ranking inequalities, however, dissuaded black men from enlisting and serving. When the British captured Havana in 1762 during the 7 Years' War, the free barber Gabriel Dorotea Barba was among the many men of African descent, free and enslaved, who rushed to the defense of their homeland. Although he was only a young man at the time, he recruited and equipped a battalion of free black men from his community. And for his act of loyalty, the Spanish crown rewarded Barba with the rank of captain. Others who joined Barba included Captain Joaquin Aponte and his son Nicolas. Cuba's black militia units fought bravely to defend their homeland, and the British gave no quarter to those black men they captured. Despite this knowledge, even enslaved men risked their lives, demonstrated their courage and honor on the battlefield, and thereby won their liberty and admission into the military corporation. A group of 20 Cuban slaves armed only with machetes and acting totally independently also launched their own offensive against the superior English force at Cuba's Great Morro Castle, killing some of the English enemy and capturing 7 more. The ladies of Havana described the slaves' heroism in a letter to the king, who freed them and awarded their leader, Andres Gutierrez, the title of captain. Another enslaved man, Manuel Medina, was similarly rewarded for leading 50 of his fellow slaves to meet the British enemy across the bay in Guanabacoa. British invaders and elite Cubans alike remarked upon the heroism of the black militiamen who fought bravely to defend their homeland, and the distinguished service of Havana's Batallón de Pardos during the British invasion. And it was recalled in a special ceremony in the Church of Espíritu Santo, which was the oldest black religious confraternity in Cuba. After a moving ceremony, the priest blessed the unit's flag, whose motto read, "Always onward to glory." Even greater honor accrued to the Batallón de Morenos, the totally black unit, when the black militiamen Antonio Soledad and Ignacio Alvarado traveled to Spain to be received in a formal audience by the monarch himself. The two men gave a performance for the king and his court, demonstrating their military prowess, and by extension, that of their comrades at home in Cuba. After kissing the king's ring, each received a Medal of Honor directly from the monarch himself. And in a status-conscious society such as Cuba, such an honor was remarkable and remarked upon. The heroism of Cuba's black troops, however, was not sufficient to keep the British from occupying Cuba in 1763, and then, as we heard, when by the Treaty of Paris, the Spanish crown recovered its pearl of the Indies, as they called it, for the lesser valued colony of Florida. Florida's black militiamen and their families were subsequently evacuated to Cuba, where the men were incorporated into various military units in Havana and Matanzas, and thereby into the at least contingent, fictive, and kin networks associated with religious brotherhoods there. And it was not long before Havana's black militia was called again to defend Spanish territory from foreigners, and this time in Louisiana, where in 1769, disaffected French colonists had risen against the Spanish governor, Antonio de Ulloa, and they had even driven him from his post. As part of a massive force of 2,100 troops under the command of General Alejandro O'Reilly, Cuba's black militias helped restore effective Spanish control of Louisiana, thereby launching a free black military tradition in that colony as well. And in subsequent years, Spain posted many of Cuba's black militiamen to other Spanish frontiers in Florida, the Yucatan, and Mexico, and some spent as many as 20 years abroad before returning to their homes, and others never saw Cuba again. But by 1770, more than 3,000 men of color had joined Cuba's militias, forming themselves into 3 battalions and 16 additional companies, and these black units were 1/4 of the island's armed forces. Cuba's militias of color helped establish Spanish control of New Orleans in 1769 and returned to the region during the American Revolution to serve under Bernardo de Galvez and with Francisco Miranda, Miranda, a compatriot of Thomas Jefferson's, as a matter of fact, but in the Gulf campaigns at Mobile and Pensacola, and also upriver at Manchaca and Baton Rouge. The famed Miranda also spent time in Havana, so it's probable that the Cuban black troops who served with him may have exchanged political ideas with the precursor to Venezuelan independence, adding to their geopolitical literacy is a term that I use for all these people that move everywhere and learn the world. For the Florida, let me show you. Bernardo de Galvez, Spanish hero of the American Revolution. So he has lots of wonderful portraits and also some artwork about his siege at Pensacola in 1781. So Galvez, for the Florida campaigns, Pardo units of militias from Cuba came with him, and some of them followed him, and earlier examples of Captain Barba, for instance, raising uniformed companies of 100 men each. And as in Barba's case, they won captaincies, right to name their subordinate officers, and they got that fuero militar, which exempted them from tribute and punishments. Captains Gabriel Dorotea Barba, Jose Aponte, who was later executed for a supposed slave conspiracy, a whole troop of these men came and fought with the Cuban militias in the Florida campaigns. And now we have statues honoring Galvez all over the United States. Washington, D.C. and Mobile are these 2 examples. But he is pretty much the Spanish hero of the American Revolution, and in these different talks I'm doing now for the 250th anniversary with the Queen Sofia Institute in Spain is sponsoring a lot of these. Everybody focuses on Galvez because it is one of the better known figures he is. So all of the people who fought with him later joined a Spanish expedition against the British in Providence in the Bahamas. They served on Spanish corsaring expeditions also throughout the Caribbean. So their military success and experience takes them all through the Caribbean, even if they began in Cuba, in some cases Florida and others. The Cuban troops, however, fought for the Spanish monarch And as they helped liberate British colonials, they gained acquaintance also with the rhetoric of our independence talk. The motto emblazoned on the flag of Cuba's Moreno battalions was victory or death, which nicely mirrors the sentiment of Patrick Henry. Thanks to some wonderful former scholars who have passed away, like Julia Scott, when I researched in Spain many years ago, he pointed out to me also the importance of black sailors in conveying all this revolutionary rhetoric and talk about independence and liberty and valor and so on as they move through the Caribbean. And yes, the sailors certainly did that, but so did these black militia troops that we're talking about as they get posted everywhere. They're telling the news everywhere of all these different radical political ideas that are being explained. So they're all eyewitnesses, they're participants in some of the most important military contests of their day. They had a wide array of information, political, both printed and oral. They made reasoned and informed choices to advance their own rights as free men. And some of them spent as many as 20 years posted abroad before getting back to Cuba, as I said. They formed families and relationships with free black militiamen with whom they served in these foreign posts, such as Florida. They acquired intimate knowledge of other places and peoples, expanded their horizons and visions. And one analysis of a 1776 census for Havana that I found shows 2/3 of all people, all free men of color between the age of 15 and 50 belonged to militias. In the corporate society, meaning you're a part of this sort of, fraternity, band of brothers kind of thing, wives, children, and household dependents also gained privileges through that military service. Due to 2 evacuations of Florida that we heard about, the first one in 1763 and the second in 1821, several generations of former slaves from Florida eventually ended their days as free militiamen in Cuba, and they reconnected to black Cuban soldiers and sailors with whom they had previously served. At the conclusion of the American Revolution and during the 18-month transition from British to Spanish rule in 1783, large numbers of former British slaves, approached the Spanish government officials to request that religious sanctuary that had been established here back as early as 1693. And other runaways had claimed that in Florida for more than a century. Governor Domingo de Quiroga had received the first runaways from Carolina in 1678, and it was Governor Manuel de Montiano who established the Freedom Seekers in their first free black town in the United States, Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, which Kathy helped me do the research for by sending me to Spain as a grad student and starting that research eons ago, long ago. Oh, here's one more image. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I missed one. All right, we'll stop with Galvez. Florida's incoming governor, Manuel de Cespedes, doubted the religious motivation of the later group of post-revolutionary freedom seekers. He was forced, however, to honor the century-old offer to shelter any slaves of the Protestants who fled to find the true faith. And to protect potential converts, the governor required all non-Spaniards to present themselves and declare their intentions to remain or depart the province and register any slaves in their possession. British Florida's outgoing governor, Patrick Tonin, protested these requirements, and he said they violated provisions of the Treaty of Paris that allowed anybody who wanted to leave the province. But he observed that many slaves were held without title, and many free blacks did not have legal title to prove their status. Despite the British governor's objections, Cespedes enforced his decree, and more than 250 people once owned by the British came forward to be registered and legitimate their free status. As previous Florida and Cuban governors had, Governor Cespedes set an example by taking some of the free black freedom seekers into his own home, and the rest he parceled out among townspeople and plantation owners who were able to shelter them, at least temporarily. And aided by these early contacts and patrons, and by their rapid adoption of Catholicism, by their respectable behavior, and by their valuable military and occupational skills, refugees from Anglo slavery became important members of the free black community in Spanish Florida. They worked hard, they defended their community when called upon, they made free lives for themselves, they acquired property, they intermarried with other successful runaways, and they proved to be a valuable source of skilled labor and military reserves for the Spanish community, despite attempts by their former owners to recover their chattel through legal channels, and the once dubious Governor Cespedes consistently supported his black subjects' rights to liberty. But in May of 1790, Spain finally yielded to the strong diplomatic pressure of Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and abrogated the Spanish sanctuary policy that had first been established in 1693, almost a century before. The Spanish governor here and everywhere posted notices in southern newspapers announcing that thereafter fugitive slaves could no longer expect to be received and freed in St. Augustine. Responding to a request for clarification from Florida's governor, the Captain General of Cuba declared that, quote, there was absolutely no doubt that runaways who had already been freed retained their freedom and their rights as Spanish subjects. The men of Florida's black militias had many opportunities to display their valor and loyalty, defending their adopted monarchy against the Jacobin invasion later in 1795, Seminole attacks triggered by William Augustus Bowles and the creation of the state of Muscogee in 1800, and that nation's declaration of war against Spain, and again in 1812 when the so-called Patriots from Georgia launched an ill-fated invasion of Spanish forces, covertly supported by President James Madison and a unit of U.S. Marines. In all of those, we had free black militiamen from Florida participating to defend what they had fought so hard for here. And that is an image of the Battle of 12 Mile Swamp in 1812, where the free black militiamen, many of them were dressed as Seminoles, as a matter of fact, the documents tell us, and they were led by a free black militiaman that I've written about, Juan Bautista Whitten, who had been one of those runaways from Carolina through Georgia into Florida. And he helped defeat the U.S. Marines at the Battle of 12 Mile Swamp. And he and his wife, Judy, and the children, Polly and Glasgow, had tried 4 times to get across the St. Mary's River to freedom in Florida, and they made it on the last try. And it was through a runaway ad from their former owner in Georgia that I first encountered them in the archives in Florida, University of Florida. And the ad was so touching about Polly gently potted with the pigs. What do you call that? Pox. And Glasgow, a smiling countenance. And it was all these wonderful things. And he became this big hero, defeated U.S. Marines in 1812. All right, in all these contests, the black militias also gained freedom. And they do all these wonderful ceremonies. I'm afraid I may be running out of time or running late for you, but we'll take you right up to 1821, where in the formal session of Florida to the Americans now, we will see this ceremony. And many of the people, as we heard, will also again transfer to Cuba, where I tracked them in those archives. I just came back from Havana in December. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. There are electrical failures, no food, no medicine. We took a lot to distribute, but I don't know what's going to happen there. But our history is totally connected to that of Cuba, Florida and Cuba. And you know, if there's anything we can do, I will hope that we manage to do it. But much of my research has been done in Cuba over the years since Eugene Lyne took me as a grad student years back. And much of the information I get, I never imagined I would be a military or a religious historian. But those are the best records because they're kept. They're never destroyed. They're serial, they're over centuries. And I finally put it all together on a website that's called slavesocieties.org. And it's all over Cuba, Brazil, everywhere, but I have a big unit on Florida, thanks to Kathy and everybody starting me off there. So all of the records that we have preserved in, with different grants from different British Library grants and so on, are up on the line, are on the website now for all of anybody to use to track families and to look at all that history. We've uploaded a lot of the documents. Any other additional resources wonderful people do and put together. I also list under each country, so it's others, stuff that could be wonderful for research too. And slavesocieties.org, and there's a little special project on Mose also that one of my grad students did and uploaded a lot of the documents and the art and so on. So anyway, Florida and Cuba. Florida's amazing. My professor didn't want me to study Florida because it wasn't Latin America and it wasn't the US. And so, but thanks to Kathy, I did it. And thank you all for coming.